Post-war nationalism, Unit 11. First of all, let's remind ourselves why nationalism is such a popular idea. Nationalism usually means independence. Either you have your independence or nationalism is motivating you to fight for your independence. Nationalism also means that people have a certain amount of power or control over what happens to them and the freedoms that they have or the things that they're able to do in society. Nationalism is also associated with wealth. It's usually a pathway for nations and individuals to obtain economic prosperity. Nationalism also drives countries to industrialize and modernize. And when we say modernize, we're talking about the process where a nation adopts new or progressive ways of thinking and doing things. Today we're going to be talking about the impact of nationalism in three areas of Asia: China, India, and several areas in Southwest Asia. Let's begin with China. Nationalists overthrew the Qing dynasty, which had been in power since 1644 in China. This happened in the early 1900s. Sun supported nationalism. He also supported democracy and economic security for the Chinese people, but he struggled to make his ideas a reality, and he turned to the military for help. That didn't go so well. The Chinese also involved themselves in the Great War. They supported the Allies and fought against Germany, hoping that when the war ended and the Allies were victorious, that they would get back some of their own territory, because Germany had colonies in China. However, after the war, the German colonies in China were actually given to Japan, so that when this part of the Treaty of Versailles was made known, there was actually an uprising protest movement in China called May 4th movement, because China still didn't get control back over land that had been taken during imperialism and colonialization. What happened next in China? The communist movement emerged, led by Mao Zedong, who wanted to lead a peasant uprising so that Chinese society could be more fair and accessible for everybody. At the same time, Sun dies, and power of the government transfers to another nationalist named Zhang Zhixi. And he sort of oversees a movement away from democratic ideals, and his government becomes more corrupt. This brings him into conflict with the communists under the leadership of Zedong, until the point that a civil war breaks out between the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists at this point are more powerful than the communists, but can't quite wipe the communists out. They have the communists surrounded in the mountains, but then in an event called the Long March, the communists actually flee north into the caves where they can hide out and kind of regroup. And it's called the Long March because it goes over about 6,000 miles, like if you walked from San Francisco to New York and back again. They crossed 18 mountain ranges, 24 rivers, and by the time they reached the caves in the north, many of the communists had died, but they hadn't been captured by the nationalists. Now, in the midst of the Civil War, we actually have the beginning of World War II in Asia. Japan invaded and annexed an area of China in the northeast called Manchuria. Manchuria was an industrialized region that had natural resources that Japan wanted and didn't have on its own island location. That happened in 1931, and then by 1937, Japan had launched an all-out invasion of China, bombing its cities and villages, destroying its farmland. So the Civil War in China is interrupted by the beginnings of what's going to be World War II. All right, let's move on to India, which was referred to as the jewel of the British crown. The British Empire, remember, was the largest in the world at the turn of the 20th century, and India was one of the richest, most populous holdings in that empire. And the Indians wanted self-government. Two different groups had established themselves for that purpose. The National Congress was largely a Hindu organization established in the late 1800s. The Muslim League was an Islamic organization that was established just after the turn of the century. Like China, India fought for Britain and for the Allies in the Great War, believing that after the war ended that they would be granted the right to rule themselves. And when that didn't happen, protests began because they weren't granted independence and there weren't really even any reforms made. The British continued to rule India and they continued to treat Indian citizens like they weren't as good as the British. Then a set of laws was passed called the Rowlatt Acts, where Indian protesters were jailed without a trial. So now Indians hadn't even gotten the right to protest and to disagree with the government, and they felt like, as British citizens even, their rights were being violated. And after that, there's a gathering of Hindus and Muslims who want to hear political speeches and think about these things that are happening at Amritsar. And what happens is that the British troops fire on this assembly. They're in a courtyard where they can't even escape, and almost 400 Indians are killed. At this point, India turns to a new leader, Mohandas Gandhi, or Mahatma, the Great Soul, as he is called. And he has kind of a unique outlook on how the Indians can go about getting their independence from Britain. First of all, he says that they should practice non-cooperation, or in the United States, we call this civil disobedience. They should break unfair laws in protest of those laws and in an effort to get the laws changed. He also wanted Indians to boycott all things that were British, their products, their schools, their taxes, and even voting in British elections. He helped organize strikes and demonstrations that made it difficult for the British to even use basic services in India, like the railroads. And he also participated in what's known as the Salt March, which was to protest the salt monopoly. Indians could only buy salt from one entity that the British government designated, and they had to pay taxes on the salt. And Gandhi wanted the Indians to give up the use of British salt and went on a march to the sea to protest this. As all of this is happening, finally the British begin to recognize that India is going to have to become more independent, and they pass what's called the Government of India Act, which provided limited self-government. But as this is happening, there starts to be a growing conflict between the Hindus and Muslims in India, and like with China, World War II breaks out. So the process of the Indians getting their independence is interrupted as well. Very briefly, let's talk about Southwest Asia. In Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, or as he's known, Ataturk, helps to establish the Republic of Turkey after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. Turkey is a republic that has separation of church and state, and it uses a Western-style legal system. It industrializes, provides rights for women, and goes through a period of economic growth. And what makes Turkey unique is that it was a religiously Islamic country that had still had religious freedom, and Islamic law didn't necessarily govern Turkey. And then we have two more examples. Iran, which had previously been Persia and had been in existence since ancient times, was organized as a modern state by Reza Shah Pahlavi. And Iran also undergoes a period of modernization, but without the institution of democratic principles like happened in Turkey. And Pahlavi organizes all the power for himself. It's a very centralized way of ruling Iran. And then the modern nation of Saudi Arabia is organized by the Saud family. Saudi Arabia also undergoes a period of modernization, but only to the extent that was allowed by traditional Islamic rule and customs. So Saudi Arabia remains very much a religious kingdom that's actually ruled by a king coming from the Saud family. And then In this same time period, the discovery of oil in Saudi Arabia and along the Persian Gulf is going to make things much more complicated in this region. This is how nationalism affected Asia in the period after World War I, or the Great War. If you need to rewind or rewatch any of this video, please feel free to do so. Thanks for listening.